Stand in the high desert of northern Nevada on a July afternoon, and you will hear that silence. The wind moves through the sagebrush in low, hollow whispers. The earth beneath your boots is cracked into polygonal plates, like a shattered mirror reflecting nothing but a white, merciless sky. The creek beds, and there are many of them etched across this landscape, are not rivers. They are wounds. Deep, vertical trenches carved 10, sometimes 15 feet into the valley floor, so steep-sided that a person standing at the bottom cannot see over the rim. These are not natural features of a timeless terrain. They are the fingerprints of a catastrophe that unfolded so slowly, across so many generations, that most people simply accepted them as the way things had always been. They were not. What happened in Nevada's high desert is a story about loss, the kind of loss that accumulates silently over a century and only becomes visible when nearly everything is already gone. But more importantly, it is a story about return. It is a story about 5 animals with orange teeth, a stubborn instinct to build, and an unconscious genius for hydrology that no human engineer has ever fully matched. In 2018, wildlife managers and restoration ecologists made a decision that, at the time, seemed almost laughably simple. They released 5 North American beavers into the incised, desiccated corridor of Suzie Creek in Elko County, Nevada. No bulldozers, no concrete, no million-dollar federal contracts. Just 5 rodents and an ancient blueprint written into their DNA over 10 million years of evolution. What followed over the next several years became one of the most documented, most dramatic, and most quietly revolutionary ecological transformations in modern American conservation history. A dead desert did not just recover. It exploded back into life. To understand what the beavers did, you must first understand what had been done to the land before they arrived. The story begins not in the 21st century, not even in the 20th, but in the early 1800s, when the great fur trade swept across the American continent like a consuming fire. At that time, North America was home to an estimated 100 to 400 million beavers. They occupied nearly every watershed on the continent, from the coastal marshes of the Atlantic to the high-elevation streams of the Rocky Mountains. In the arid Great Basin, the vast, internally draining region that covers most of Nevada, portions of Utah, Oregon, and Idaho, beavers were the invisible engineers of an entire hydrological civilization. They built dams of mud and willow that slowed the spring snow melt, spread water across the valley floors, and recharged the groundwater that kept the desert alive through the long, rainless summers. They had been performing this function, without interruption, for thousands of years. Then, in the space of roughly 4 decades, they were almost entirely eliminated. European and American trappers, responding to a seemingly insatiable European demand for beaver felt hats, moved systematically through the watersheds of the West. By the 1840s, beaver were functionally extinct across vast stretches of the Great Basin. The landscape that remained looked, at first, largely unchanged. Sagebrush still covered the hillsides. Grasses still grew along the creek margins. But something invisible and catastrophic had begun to unfold. With no dams to slow the spring floods, the water that poured down from the Independence Mountains and the Ruby Range each April began to move with unchecked velocity. Fast-moving water is not a gentle force. It is a geological sculptor, and it carves with relentless efficiency. Year after year, the spring floods cut deeper into the soft alluvial soils of the valley floors. The process is called stream incision, and it operates with a brutal, self-reinforcing logic. As the stream channel cuts downward, the water table in the surrounding land drops to match it. As the water table drops, the vegetation that depends on shallow groundwater, the willows, the sedges, the native grasses, the deep-rooted wildflowers, begins to die. As the vegetation dies, the soil loses the root systems that held it together, making it more susceptible to erosion, which accelerates the cutting of the channel, which drops the water table further. It is a spiral, and it moves in only one direction. By the late 20th century, Suzie Creek and streams like it across northern Nevada had transformed from broad, braided, marshy corridors into narrow, deeply incised trenches. The technical term for what they had become is arroyos, but a more honest description might be scars. The creek would run briefly and violently in the spring, carrying enormous loads of topsoil downstream to the Humboldt River, and then stop running entirely by midsummer, leaving cracked mud and bleaching fish skeletons on a bone-dry bed. The surrounding meadows, once lush enough to support entire communities of wildlife, had become dominated by sagebrush and invasive cheatgrass, plants that thrive in dry, disturbed soil but provide a fraction of the ecological value of the native plant communities they replaced. Human beings tried to fix this, as human beings often do, with machinery and money. Excavators were brought in, concrete weirs were poured, rock riprap was trucked in and dumped along eroding banks. Some of these interventions bought time. Few of them addressed the fundamental problem. A concrete weir does not think. It does not repair itself after a flood. It does not respond to drought by releasing stored water, or to erosion by packing sediment into its structure, or to a warm spring by building itself higher. The landscape needed something that concrete cannot be: alive, responsive, and relentless. When the 5 beavers were released into Susie Creek, they were not performing an act of ecological charity. They were looking for a place to live. This distinction matters enormously, because it explains why they succeeded where human engineers had repeatedly fallen short. A beaver does not approach a damaged watershed as a problem to be solved. It approaches it as a home to be secured. And for a beaver, security means one thing above all else: deep, still water. On land, a beaver is slow and vulnerable, easy prey for coyotes, mountain lions, and golden eagles. In water, particularly in deep, pond water with an underwater entrance to a lodge, a beaver is almost impossible to catch. The drive to create that water is not rational or calculated. It is existential. It is the difference between life and death, and beavers pursue it with the single-mindedness that no salaried restoration ecologist can replicate. Within days of their release, the 5 beavers began doing what beavers do. They cut willow stems along the creek margin, the few that remained in the degraded corridor, and began wedging them perpendicular to the flow of water in the incised channel. These first structures were modest, almost laughable by the standards of what would eventually be built, but they immediately began to change the physics of the stream. Fast-moving water, when it encounters a barrier of interlocked branches and mud, does not simply pile up behind it. It slows, spreads, and loses energy. And when water loses energy, it drops whatever it has been carrying. The heavy silts, sands, and gravels that had been scouring the creek bed for over a century began to settle behind the beavers' first crude dam. The trench began, imperceptibly at first, to fill. What the beavers were doing, without any awareness that they were doing it, was reversing the fundamental geometry of water movement through the valley. An incised stream concentrates flow, speeds water up, and exports sediment. A beaver complex disperses flow, slows water down, and imports sediment. These are not minor differences in degree. They are opposite hydrological states, and the transition from one to the other, accomplished by 5 animals working through the Nevadanites with mud-packed paws and industrious orange incisors, represented one of the most efficient geomorphic transformations per unit of cost that restoration science has ever documented. As the first pond began to form behind the primary dam, the beavers expanded their operation. They dug channels extending outward from the main pond into the surrounding sagebrush flats, using these waterways to float timber and to access building materials without exposing themselves to predators. But these canals had a secondary effect that the beavers had not planned and did not know about. They acted as irrigation conduits, pushing water laterally into soil that had not been wet in living memory. The dry, compacted earth surrounding the creek, the earth that had been described by one hydrologist as having the water retention capacity of a parking lot, began to absorb moisture for the first time in decades. This lateral movement of water, driven by the hydrostatic pressure of the beaver pond, initiated a process that would prove to be the most consequential aspect of the entire restoration. Beneath the surface of the valley floor, something ancient and dormant began to wake up. In arid landscapes, the surface tells only a small fraction of the hydrological story. The real story, the story that determines whether a place lives or dies through a dry summer, whether it can sustain fish through August, whether its plants can survive a drought year, is written underground, in the vast network of pores and channels within the alluvial soil that hydrologists call the aquifer. In a healthy riparian system, this underground reservoir is the landscape savings account. The spring floods make the deposits, and the summer draws them down slowly, releasing water back into the stream as a cool, steady base flow that keeps the creek running, the water cold, and the fish alive long after the last rain has fallen. In Susie Creek, before the Beavers, this savings account was empty. The incised channel had acted for decades as a drain, pulling water out of the surrounding soil and routing it downstream. The aquifer was not just low. In places, it was functionally depleted, the water table sitting 15 or 20 feet below the surface, far beyond the reach of even the deepest-rooted native plants. The beaver pond changed this with a mechanism that is elegantly simple. When water pools behind a dam, it exerts pressure in all directions, not just downstream, but sideways and downward. This pressure pushes water into the surrounding soil, recharging the aquifer in a process called lateral recharge. The effect is disproportionate to what is visible. Hydrologists who have studied beaver-influenced watersheds consistently find that for every gallon of water visible on the surface of a beaver pond, between 5 and 10 gallons are stored invisibly in the saturated soil surrounding it. The subterranean sponge, as this phenomenon is sometimes called, is the hidden engine of the entire system. As this underground storage filled through the first and second years of the beaver's residency at Susie Creek, the effects began to appear on the surface in ways that startled even the most experienced restoration ecologists. Water began seeping from the banks of the creek at points hundreds of yards downstream from any visible dam. The soil, previously cracked and pale, darkened and softened, and then, in what one observer described as one of the most extraordinary things he had seen in 30 years of field work, plants began to grow from ground that had appeared completely sterile. Not invasive weeds, native plants. Willows, sedges, rushes, and native bunchgrasses emerged from a soil seed bank that had lain dormant, waiting, sometimes for 30 years or more, for exactly the signal that was now arriving moisture. The implications of this underground transformation extend well beyond the visible recovery of vegetation. Soil that is saturated with water behaves fundamentally differently from dry soil in one critically important respect. It does not burn. As the beaver complex rehydrated the valley floor, it created what fire ecologists have begun to recognize as one of the most effective natural firebreaks in the western landscape. While the sagebrush-covered hillside surrounding Susie Creek remained as flammable as ever, and wildfires in northern Nevada have grown dramatically in scale and intensity over the past 2 decades due to the spread of invasive cheatgrass, the beaver-managed corridor stayed green, moist, and resistant to ignition even in the peak of summer fire season. This firebreak function is not incidental. It is, increasingly, one of the most compelling arguments for large-scale beaver reintroduction across the American West. A wildfire moving through dry sagebrush country does not negotiate. It consumes everything in its path with a thoroughness that can set a landscape back decades. But a wildfire that encounters a beaver wetland encounters something it cannot overcome: water. The flames diminish, slow, and often stop at the margins of the hydrated zone, leaving behind an island of living vegetation in a sea of ash. During the fire, that island functions as a refuge. Deer, elk, songbirds, reptiles, and small mammals converge on it from the surrounding burning landscape. After the fire, it functions as a nursery, providing the seeds, the rootstock, and the animal populations from which the surrounding landscape will eventually recover. Ecological recovery, when it comes to a long-degraded landscape, does not arrive gradually. It arrives in cascades. One change enables another, which enables another, which enables a dozen more simultaneously, until the system is generating complexity faster than any observer can track. This is what happened at Susie Creek. The willows came first, as they always do in recovering riparian systems, because willows are among the most water-responsive plants on the planet. A willow root that reaches moisture will follow it with extraordinary speed, and the newly rehydrated soil of the Susie Creek corridor provided exactly the signal the dormant willow root stock had been waiting for. Within 2 growing seasons of the beaver's arrival, dense thickets of coyote willow and yellow willow had established along the margins of the beaver ponds and along the newly activated side channels. These were not small, stressed plants. They were vigorous, rapidly growing shrubs that quickly reached heights of 6, 8, and 10 feet, creating for the first time in decades a canopy over the water. That canopy mattered enormously to one species in particular. The Lahontan cutthroat trout is Nevada's native trout, a fish of striking beauty, with copper and gold flanks marked with large, distinctive spots and a slash of red beneath the jaw that gives the cutthroat group its name. It is also a fish under severe pressure. Lahontan cutthroats require cold, clear, deep water to survive the Nevada summer, and the warming and drying of the state streams over the past century has eliminated them from the vast majority of their historical range. In the incised, unshaded, intermittent Susie Creek of the pre-beaver era, they could not survive. By the third year after the beavers' arrival, they were back, holding in the cool, deep water at the base of the beaver dams, in the shade of the willow canopy, in water that was several degrees colder than the unshaded channels downstream. Their return triggered responses up and down the food web. Insects, drawn by the vegetation and the still water of the ponds, appeared in extraordinary abundance. Dragonflies and damselflies patrolled the pond margins. Aquatic invertebrates colonized the silted pond bottoms, and the insects drew birds, migratory songbirds that use riparian corridors as critical stopover habitat during their twice-yearly journeys across the continent. Yellow warblers, willow flycatchers, song sparrows, and common yellowthroats arrived in numbers that had not been recorded in the Susie Creek drainage in the living memory of anyone who birded the area. They found, in the middle of a landscape that had been biologically impoverished for generations, a sudden abundance of food, nesting sites, and shelter. Amphibians colonized the beaver ponds with an enthusiasm that surprised researchers. Great Basin spadefoot toads, Columbia spotted frogs, and Pacific chorus frogs all established breeding populations in the calm, shallow margins of the ponds, habitat that had simply not existed in the area for decades. Their populations grew rapidly because the still, vegetated waters of a beaver pond are almost perfectly suited to amphibian reproduction, warm enough for egg development, vegetated enough to provide cover from predators, and chemically complex enough to support the enormous densities of aquatic invertebrates that tadpoles require. Mule deer began using the corridor more heavily, drawn by the high-quality forage of the wet meadow grasses that were establishing along the pond margins. Pronghorn appeared. Mink established territories along the creek. Great blue herons arrived to exploit the shallow water hunting opportunities in the pond margins. A pair of sandhill cranes, one of the most charismatic and vulnerable bird species in the Great Basin, nested in the emergent vegetation at the edge of one of the larger ponds. Every one of these arrivals was made possible by the work of 5 animals that had no awareness of, and no interest in, the ecological drama they were enabling. The transformation of Susie Creek did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred on a working landscape, surrounded by cattle ranches, mining operations, and rural communities that have their own long and complicated relationship with the land and with the water that flows across it. In the American West, water is not simply a resource. It is identity, history, and survival. Water rights predate statehood in Nevada, and the legal framework that governs them, the doctrine of prior appropriation, often summarized as first in time, first in right, was designed for a world of irrigation ditches and stock ponds, not beaver complexes and naturally meandering streams. The initial reaction among some members of the ranching community to the beaver reintroduction was, predictably, skeptical. Beavers flood pastures. They chew through fence posts. They dam irrigation diversions. They are, from the perspective of anyone trying to manage water precisely on a working ranch, an unpredictable complication. But the ranchers who owned land in the Susie Creek watershed had something that overrode ideology. They were paying attention. And what they observed over the course of 2, 3, and 4 years following the beavers' arrival was not the disaster they had anticipated. It was something they had not seen in years. Their pastures were greener. Their springs were running later into the summer. Their cattle were in better condition coming off the range in the fall. The beaver complex, by raising the water table beneath the adjacent meadows, had effectively converted dryland range into what agronomists call subirrigated meadow, pasture that receives water from below, through capillary action from a shallow water table, rather than from above through rainfall alone. This type of meadow is far more productive, far more drought resilient, and far more nutritionally valuable to livestock than the sagebrush-invaded range that had dominated the valley for the previous century. The ranchers did not become beaver enthusiasts overnight, and the relationship between restoration practitioners and working ranchers in Nevada remains complex, negotiated, and sometimes contentious. But the economic evidence was difficult to argue with. During the drought years that have become an increasingly regular feature of the Great Basin climate, the ranches adjacent to functioning beaver complexes consistently outperformed those on degraded streams. The beavers were providing, free of charge and without subsidy, a drought buffering service that no irrigation infrastructure could replicate at anywhere near the same cost. Policy began to shift in response to this evidence. Land management agencies, including the Bureau of Land Management, which oversees millions of acres of public land in Nevada, began to move resources away from expensive, machinery-intensive restoration projects and toward what practitioners now call low-tech, process-based restoration, an approach that uses simple interventions, including the installation of hand-built wooden structures that mimic beaver dams, to jumpstart the natural processes that self-sustaining beaver populations eventually take over entirely. The calculations underlying this shift are straightforward. A heavy equipment restoration project might cost $500,000 and cover a few hundred yards of creek, with no guarantee of durability. A beaver colony, once established, covers miles of watershed, repairs its own infrastructure after every flood, and becomes more effective with each passing year. The 5 beavers released into Susie Creek in 2018 did not know they were making history. They were building a home. They were following an imperative written into their biology millions of years before the first human being looked at a flowing stream and thought about how to control it. They did not file permits. They did not submit environmental impact assessments. They did not wait for funding. They simply went to work, night after night, in the cold water of a desert creek, pressing mud into sticks and sticks into mud, raising the level of a pond 1 fraction of an inch at a time. What they achieved, measured in the scientific language of hydrology, ecology, and climate resilience, is extraordinary. They restored perennial flow to a stream that had run dry every summer for decades. They raised the local water table by several feet, rehydrating hundreds of acres of riparian soil. They rebuilt a functioning food web from near zero, enabling the return of native fish, amphibians, songbirds, and large mammals to a landscape that had been biologically simplified to near collapse. They created a firebreak of living, water-saturated vegetation in one of the most fire-vulnerable landscapes in North America. They sequestered carbon in the anaerobic sediments accumulating at the bottom of their ponds. They buffered a working ranch community against the impacts of drought. And they did all of this for the cost of a few willow stems and an unbroken instinct to build. The lesson of Susie Creek is not simply that beavers are remarkable animals, though they are. It is something more fundamental and more challenging. It is that the landscapes we have labeled dead deserts are, in most cases, not dead at all. They are landscapes in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the restoration of a single missing process, the slowing, spreading, and storing of water, to wake them up. The seeds are in the soil. The rootstock is underground. The migratory birds know the corridor. The fish remember the stream. Everything that is needed for recovery is already present, waiting at the margins of possibility, requiring only the return of the architect that makes it possible. We spent a century removing that architect, and then spent decades and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to substitute for it with concrete and machinery, with partial and temporary success. Then, in a high desert creek in northern Nevada, someone made a different choice. Someone stepped back. Someone let 5 beavers walk into a dead desert, and the desert, after a century of silence, finally answered. The most sophisticated restoration technology we have ever discovered does not run on electricity or require a permit. It runs on instinct, builds with mud, and has been refining its methods since before our species existed. The lesson of Nevada is not that we should stop managing our landscapes. It is that we should be considerably more humble about what management means and considerably more willing to recognize genius when it arrives.